right, so I interviewed Nadia back in August about the curious new life of an old Latin send-off in epistolary letters. Cura ut valias, take care that you be well. And given the seriousness of the pandemic, Nadia and I talked a lot about that new life, that new residence to something as sort of perfunctory as an email send-off when you say take care at the end of an email. In the comments underneath, though, one of the viewers asked about the strange and maybe more ominous new life of another Latin word, or in this case, an acronym. And I brought Nadia back, as well as Nathan Rees from Art, to discuss it with me. So Nadia and Nathan, the acronym under consideration today is S.P.Q.R, which I know Nadia knows, and I'm probably pretty sure that Nathan knows too. It means Senatus Populusque Romanus, which is the Senate and people of Rome. It's an insignia that the Republic used from AD BC on. And it was originally a source of great civic pride. It was emblazoned on standards and monuments. Even today in Rome, you see it everywhere. You see it on sewer covers and water fountains and t-shirts and socks even, I was looking up today. It's also the name of a fairly recent history of Rome, S.P.Q.R. But this viewer was more interested in another use of S.P.Q.R, and he wondered whether it's true that alt-right and far-right fringe groups have adopted and co-opted the S.P.Q.R insignia and what that might mean. So I guess I'll start with Nadia. Is that something that you're seeing out there? And what do you have to say about that?
So if you look in the right spots on the internet, there are quite a few alt-right groups that have co-opted not just this particular symbol, but plenty of other ancient sayings, authors, events. And S.P.Q.R is one of them, and there are two modern scholars who have done quite a bit of analysis of this. Sarah Bond and Donna Zuckerberg have both published on this. But S.P.Q.R, it's interesting. So you actually listed, so without even realizing, you mentioned one of the misconceptions about it that dates back to Mussolini. So you mentioned how it used to be on military standards. It was not. We have no evidence that this was ever a military thing. But in the modern co-option, it is. So on war games that so many people get obsessed with, and also in alt-right rhetoric, it is a military kind of war cry. And that's partly how Mussolini used it. Although I find the use of S.P.Q.R on both military standards and, by contrast, manhole covers of all things to be hilarious. But you know, as we all know, a great civilization has to rely on a good sewer system. So absolutely, long live Cloaca Maxima. That said, though, the ominous part of it all is that misuse of the ancient world can get dangerous. So for instance, one example is Sparta. So the same people who might co-opt S.P.Q.R to be a symbol of fascism today, although they wouldn't call it that, would also try to present themselves as sort of like the embodiment of modern Spartans. And this is where it gets into white supremacy and all of this, like the best and greatest soldiers. And some of this is a misunderstanding of the ancient world, and some of it is taking real elements of the ancient world, like the Spartan obsession with eugenics, producing the best soldier, and using it to justify the rhetoric of white supremacy. And this is dangerous. So we see quite a bit of misuse of the ancient world. Somebody might read just a little bit, just enough to be dangerous, if you will, without understanding the ancient context. And so, for example, some alt-right thinkers have used Plato and Aristotle to justify ideas that not all people are created to be citizens. Some people really were made to be slaves in a society. So a lot of this, or the Spartan idea of eugenics, if somebody is not fit to be a good member of society, well, just throw them off a cliff. So these ideas are very much antithetical to our modern concept that all human life is valuable just because it is. So these are really extreme kind of ideas that get used then to justify such stances as anti-immigration. And for that one in particular, the writings of an 18th century classicist or ancient historian, Edward Gibbon, have been used to justify the stance of anti-immigration based on Gibbon's analysis of the fall of Rome. So there's a lot of just misinterpretation of the classics in this regard. Of course, not all ignorance is or misinterpretation is necessarily harmful or hateful. And one example perhaps is Trojans. I'm really sorry, Trojan Nation, but Troy lost the Trojan War. So whenever you celebrate victories, you are celebrating kind of a rewriting of history, which perhaps is okay. But there are a lot of elements of this rhetoric, this misinterpretation and misuse of the ancient world that do get that end up being targeted towards hate speech. And one example especially is white supremacy. And that's where I think Nathan is much more qualified than I am to talk about it, because there is so much about white marbles as the ideal of the beautiful whiteness and so on and so forth. I guess I'll pass it off to Nathan now.
Yeah, no, that is a fascinating phenomenon that we think about the color of ancient statuary as meaning something related to race or ethnicity in ways that it was never intended to do. And it's also fascinating because so much ancient statuary was actually not monochrome white. Lots of it was made using a variety of different materials, ranging from bronze to gold to various different hues of marble and other stone. And then even marble and bronze statues were decorated with paint, with, in some cases, full polychromy. So like an image of a person made of marble, where that person's skin would be entirely painted in a particular hue. So this idea about whiteness as being sort of an essential quality of ancient statuary is really just a total myth. And it's fascinating to me too, because it's one of the myths that's just hardest to overturn. And I think a lot of it has to do with our kind of ways of being led to judge that as a positive value about ancient art. And that also goes back to the Enlightenment, and in particular, with a philosopher and an early art historian named Johann Winkelmann, who interpreted that whiteness and that absence of color in classical sculpture as meaning that those artworks, they weren't like medieval art that just appealed to your base emotions or your senses. Instead, they were thought to have been all about appealing to the intellect. And so that sort of pristineness that they associated with the lack of color really got integrated into the Enlightenment way of thinking about those artworks that had really nothing to do with the way that they were understood in the classical world. And that's not to say that, you know, because now these images appear to us as white, that somehow our appreciation of their current state is in and of itself based on ideas about race, but it's tied in with those ideas, certainly. And for many of those Enlightenment thinkers, it was even a way for them to understand how maybe their Northern European civilizations were more closely related to people of classical antiquity than the people of the Mediterranean who lived in those areas at that time. And it became, even in the 18th century, a kind of a racist argument that classical statuary represented something more pristine or more pure, quote unquote, than the people that were then living in places like Greece or Italy.
So these misreadings and misappropriations and co-options, I mean, this is nothing new. That's the first thing we ought to realize, that this has been going on for quite a long time. What is our role as educators in this conversation? Like, how do we assuage what's happening with these sort of co-options?
Well, one thing I talk about in my survey history classes is just how diverse and multicultural the ancient world really was, that it wasn't just all a bunch of white people in the Mediterranean. That
Yeah.
in the Roman Empire especially, people moved around a lot. So I just taught a class last spring on travel, trade, and tourism in the ancient world. And people traveled from all over the ancient world. There were connections to the Indian Ocean. There were connections all the way to China. So even, so you could see, if you were especially in a large city like Alexandria or Rome, you would have seen people of every color of skin, if you will. And that's lost, like what Nathan described, because of the paint that has not survived. We don't see this on our artwork. But if you think about it. So for instance, someone like Augustine in late antiquity, we know for sure that this is somebody from North African descent who clearly was not white. And to give an even more obvious example that gets brought up in conversation is Jesus.
Yeah.
He would not have looked white.
Sure. You mean not blonde hair and blue eyed?
No, believe it or not. Also,
Strangely.
it did not snow during Christmas. But anyway, that's a whole another.
And Nathan, on the art side, art history, I mean, does this come up in your classes as well? This kind of correction to an old myth?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you're suggesting is really important, that we, instead of thinking about this as just being an issue that maybe has no relation to anything but like some archaeological details, it's like, oh, well, you know what, it turns out that they had some paint on them. Though it really should help us to stop and think about why we appreciate certain historical works, or why we think about ourselves as having a particular kind of a connection to maybe some people from antiquity and not others, or how we would maybe think about this kind of heritage coming from antiquity as being one set of people's heritage and not really the world's heritage in a way. And so it really, I think, is an opportunity to kind of expand our thinking beyond the narrow ways that we tend to focus our thinking in the contemporary world.